Welcome to Unmasking the Realities, Racial Equity in Education. I am Christopher Miller, Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement here at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. You're welcome to post comments and questions in the chat, and we'll address as many of them as we can in approximately about 45 minutes. Racial equity is a matter of concern in nearly every aspect of our society. This is a systemic issue entrenched in the social construct of race. Racial equity is corrective justice for communities that have suffered oppression. Equity seeks to repair the damage due to a long history of legislated racism. In education, many may not realize there is an equity problem because of the biases and prejudice that exist in education, training, and upbringing. Without question, this affects student outcomes, teaching performance, curriculum, admission practices, and more. For example, when public schools were desegregated, many of the well-qualified Black teachers were not given the opportunity to teach in an integrated classroom. Systematically, the Black school board member, superintendent, principal, and teacher was devalued in an integrated educational system. Today, we live in that legacy where we have school districts who claim that they have difficulty in obtaining Black talent, no genuine action towards resolving the matter. I've witnessed this as an involved parent and taxpayer. In the school district where I reside in the northwest area of the city, the issue of racial equity has been a growth opportunity within the culture of that school district. I'm sure there are other districts throughout the nation that embody the same culture in not genuinely valuing corrective justice. So we're here today to talk about it. I have joining with me a wonderful panel. I have Dr. Littisha Bates. She is a parent, teacher, researcher, and associate dean at the University of Cincinnati. We have Shadiyah Cammack. She's a teacher, former intern here at our museum. She's been teaching for 2 years in Chicago, Illinois. We have Yolanda Lauderdale. She is a parent, teacher in the Cincinnati Public Schools District. And we also have Whitney Owens, who is a parent, a colleague in the museum field, and chief learning officer at the Cincinnati Museum Center. And lastly, we have Monique Seward, a parent and special education teacher in Atlanta, Georgia. I welcome all of you and thank you for participating in this conversation. And so we have a lot to get through, and I want to make sure that we get through as much as possible. We won't be able to solve everything in just one conversation here today, but I definitely want to use our time wisely as we tackle these questions. And so to get us started, I would like to ask Dr. Littisha Bates to kick us off. And to really invest in equity, schools need to become more equity-minded. They may need to audit their own practices and, if needed, revise them to be more race-conscious. Should educators make this a priority? And if so, how can this mindfulness about racial equity be integrated into the educational culture?
Chris, thank you so much for having me today. I would just first like to point out, you put together an amazing dynamic panel of all women. So shout out to you for being smart enough to do that. And then the next thing I'll say before I answer your question is, it's Chicago, Illinois. We don't say Illinois. I hate it when people do that. Shadiyah knows exactly what I'm talking about, and so does Whitney, because living in Chicago, we hear it all the time. But we can
Illinois, I apologize.
But I think the real issue, so to answer the question is absolutely, this should be a #1 priority for educators, for those that are making decisions about our schools. But the fundamental issue is folks have to understand that the system is not broken, but in fact operating in the way that it was designed to operate, right? And so we like to often try to talk about fixing broken systems. This implies that the system was working properly for mostly everyone, but just not serving a couple of people. And we know that not to be true, right? We know that there is rampant systemic inequality in education systems. And so when we talk about creating more equity-minded schools, we have to completely dismantle the whole way that we think about schooling and how schools were created in our country, right? Schools were not created for marginalized children, for Black children, for brown children, for immigrant children to become educated in that kind of way, right? And so when we're talking about creating more equity-minded processes, that implies, one, that we understand what equity is, because a lot of people talk about equality, 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 and I'm over here like, no, equity, right? And so it is assuming a lot of things. It's assuming that people are willing to admit that their systems are faulty, and that their systems aren't equally serving everyone. And that is really hard, because when people start talking about the system in that way, people take it very personally, internalize it, right? And so if you say your system needs to be dismantled, people get really nervous because they think that you're saying something about them, right? Like, but no, I'm a good person. And it's like, yep, you might be a good person, but you're a good person in a system that is continually creating and ramping up inequality. And so what are you going to do about that, right? And so I think the short of it is absolutely, it's essential. And we've seen it during COVID, for those who are making decisions about schools to be clear about the fact that the system is working perfectly, but it is wrong. It is created with an unequal foundation. And so we need to just dismantle that thing and start over so that we can unlearn all the bad behaviors. I work in higher ed, and one of the things that we often talk about is there's such a low number of minority students, Black students in STEM. Oh, well, that's because they don't like math or they're not good at math. No, that's because teachers have been programmed that they're not going to do well in math. So when they get in school, they're treated as such, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So we just got to tear that whole thing up, dismantle what we understand it to be, and really just start over.
Would anyone like to add to this question before we go to the next one, by any chance?
Just one quick thing. I'm sorry. Just one quick thing to add on to Dr. DeVay's, because she's absolutely right. Because I've seen kids that are more interested in, okay, well, I can do gym. I'm good at that. But it's a matter of they're never introduced to STEM. Like for me, I imagine what would I be like if I actually knew about hidden figures? If someone actually told me or properly educated me on math and science, I would actually probably be better at it. But instead, it was more focused on, okay, we can barely do English and we can do some social work studies and things like that, but actually getting kids opportunities to actually see people who look like them do what they never see, which is someone being good at a subject they don't know much about or they're poorly taught. So she's absolutely right with that.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to, the next thing I was talking about, or aspect, is actually looking at that word equity, and also understanding that it is not the same as diversity. Diversity seeks to increase representation of historically marginalized students, faculty, and administrators. However, often it doesn't focus on correcting the unjust culture, where equity aims to fix a system's conditions that causes the inclusion. And so, Moniece, I ask from your perspective, what are the glaring realities about racial equity in education?
Oh, that's such a good question, Chris. And to be honest with you, I've been turning it over for a few days because I was thinking, if Chris had asked me this question on the spot, I would have had to answer whatever came to mind first. But since I had time to think about it, I was struggling because I am a special education teacher. That is my lens for looking at everything regarding education. So my first thought was, I can't separate racial equity. I can't separate it from everything else because, as you all know, there have been, I want to call them sound bites about the overrepresentation of Black students in special education. However, what we're not discussing when we throw that out there is the fact that, number one, there's also a lot of miseducation regarding special education out there, especially in the Black community. And I think part of that has to do with us being very prideful and having someone say that your child has a disability. We take it as a personal attack on us, and we try to figure out, oh, well, what did I do wrong to make my child be born with a disability? So I think a lot of the misconception comes in right there, because we don't understand that learning disabilities are something that are out of our control. It's something that happens in the brain when the brain is developing. We have absolutely no control over it, none. So I think since we're not approaching it with that mindset, we want to say that, oh, because a school, say if a school is majority African American, people will say, well, oh, why are there so many Black boys or Black kids in general in special education? Well, the majority of the students at the school are African American. Or it could be at a school that the majority of the kids are Hispanic. It just depends on what the population is. So it's hard for me to separate special education from that conversation, because it's what I do. It's what I do every day. But I also want to make sure I add that we have to have these conversations with that in mind, because if we really want to serve these students, like Dr. Bates was saying, that higher ed says the kids they're not good at math or they don't like it. A lot of those kids have a learning disability that's very specific to math. So unless we are ready to have that conversation and address that math disability, we're going to continue to see very few kids who look like us go into STEM fields when they go to college. But back to your original question, it's so many layers to racial inequity in schools, because you have to think about redlining, property taxes, underfunding schools, money mismanagement in school districts. Where do we start? Because it's like a circle almost. There's no specific starting or ending point. It just goes on and on and on. But we have to pick one of those things and say, okay, with this one specific thing here, how does this affect the funding that our kids get? So we talk about redlining. We've all heard it, even if it was new to us before this year. We've all heard it, and we know what it is now. So we talk about redlining, property taxes. All those things play into what we're able to do for our kids in school. So again, race can't be separated from the other things, because they're all interconnected. It's kind of like intersectionality. You know how we're talking about racism and misnomer, and we cannot separate those things because they're so interconnected. But like Dr. Bates said, when you begin talking about a system and what's wrong with the system, people take it as a personal attack, and we never get anywhere. And my situation is the opposite, because I'm in schools that are majority Black or Hispanic students, and the majority of my colleagues are Black. So when you bring up these things, I'm expecting us to be a little bit further in the game in terms of talking about equity, but we're not, because it's ingrained in us to only discuss race when it comes to test scores. So go ahead.
Let me ask this question, because I know that you and Shadiyah are work with special education.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, and I understand that school districts, I guess, are different county to county, state to state.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things in my involvement living in the state of Ohio that I had an issue with and continue to have an issue with is how they identify students. Students that are minority students and students that have disability. And when I go to school board meetings, they will use the term these subgroups.
Mm-hmm.
And it really harkens back to looking at these individuals are subhuman, being less than human, just by that terminology. And so I'm curious, and anyone on the panel can answer that. Do you have any feelings about how these students are identified? And that, does your state also identify students with disability as subgroups?
Actually, let me tell you, that's one of the subgroups. But again, it's that terminology that people use when they're discussing test scores or attendance or graduation rates. So it's students with disabilities, it's English language learners, students who receive free or reduced lunch, and then it goes Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, et cetera, et cetera. They're all referred to as subgroups, and I don't like the terminology. There's something about that it kind of, my face just like, when people start talking about it, or they refer to my students as IEP kids or the SPED kids. And I feel like we're beyond the point where we should be using better language. because we should know better by now. Because if you step into a classroom, you're telling me that you've been prepared to be in a classroom with whichever students show up. So you need to be able to not only engage and form relationships, but you should be able to refer to those students in a respectful manner. But because we're so hyper-focused on test scores and numbers and data, and we're into categorizing kids into quote unquote subgroups, that's just how we do it. And it's very uncomfortable when you're in a school setting and you're the only person bothered by it. Because when you speak up and say something, people think you're complaining. But again, my situation is different because most of my colleagues are Black. So when I try to have these conversations with people who look like me, I'm not expecting to be not taken seriously or kind of to be dismissed. I'm not expecting that from my own folks, because we know this struggle. We've already done this. We're just going to copy and paste and make a couple edits so we can get the kids who like the Hispanic kids. It's time for us to help them. We have to help them. We have to help the kids whose parents are migrant farm workers who are coming here and they have limited English. It's time for us to help them because we already know what to do. We're not starting over. We already know what to do to help these students, but we can't have these conversations and talk about people as human beings because we have to refer to them as their testing group or their testing level or their RTI tier or whatever.
Chris, if I could add to that, I think one of the things that we find ourselves struggling with is none of us are immune to supremacist things that have been ingrained in us, right? Like we are all just part of a system. And so we might do better in some areas and not in others because we have to unlearn those behaviors, right? And so even marginalized groups perpetuate economic superiority, racial superiority. And it's really about unlearning and being able to call that behavior out, which is often very difficult. And then also trying to contend with two realities, right? And so the reality that we really do have Black children that have learning disabilities that need help that we could give them if we take the wool off of our eyes and help them. But at the same time, we also have lots of Black children that are being funneled into special ed unnecessarily, right? And so trying to balance those two realities, it's very difficult. And so just remembering, like, you know, none of us are immune to these supremacist ideologies that have been really taught into us from a very, very young age, right? And cognitive dissonance, right? Two things that are not the same, feeling the same. Like that is legit. That's real.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to get Whitney into this conversation as well. And I will ask, you know, many educational scholars will say by surveying educators' beliefs and practices, we can better understand how their respective views on race impact educational outcomes. And so from your perspective, how important is it to have a understanding of educators' respective beliefs and practices in regards to race? Or we can even go, you know, in the direction what we've been talking about when we talk about students with disability as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important and really important for educators to be willing to confront their own biases and acknowledge just what Dr. Bates said, that we all have biases. There is no getting away from it. And so just, you know, accepting that and moving on to interrogate what those biases are and think about how we can help ourselves pause and really think through a situation in the decisions that we're making. So Dr. Bates mentioned sometimes kids of color are funneled one way, you know, or another. Thinking about like Indigenous students, you know, Native American students are twice as likely to be in a special education program. Now, you know, is that because of something inherent, you know, to Native American DNA? No, of course not. That's a clear. And you also see that Black students are more likely to be identified as special education for behavioral issues, that they're labeled as having an emotional disability. And you think about, you know, behavioral challenges, that's a highly subjective estimation, right? And so teachers, I think, have to be willing to think through, like, who am I putting in categories and why am I putting them there? And what about, you know, my experience and bias might affect that. There's a really interesting program at the Science Museum in Minnesota called PAGE, and that sort of outlived its acronym. But they decided that instead of doing what science museums will sometimes do with teacher professional development, which is say, we're going to teach you how to teach science, that they would focus on, we're going to look at systems of oppression, we're going to look at bias, and we're going to look at how those show up in education. And we're going to take that strategy and see what that does. And in fact, they saw improvements in test scores, improvements in teaching, improvement in overall districts when they took that approach, rather than one that is very directed at like a subject teaching method or that kind of thing. And have now expanded the work to museum educators, and Cincinnati Museum Center participated in that program for informal educators. And I think that shows the promise of districts and schools who are willing to get real about the systemic issues and acknowledge that they're there. And you see in all the data, clearly they are, and think through, how do we build a supportive network where educators have the resources and the training they need to think through their own bias and build in, supportive systems and networks to think at every level of that system, right? How it's affecting learners, and be able to continually revisit that, because the work is never done. It's a continual process. And, we learn a little bit more, thankfully, each time we do it. And I think part of that is also thinking through education in a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. And there's been a lot written about that by Carol Dweck and others, thinking about, grit. And instead of saying, we mentioned earlier, telling a kid early on, like, well, you're good at math or you're bad at math. You're good at English or you're bad at English. Recognizing that you can get better at anything with practice, and you are not a fixed, like our minds are not fixed. We can learn and get better at anything throughout our life. So I think if we, adopt the same mentality for ourselves, that we can learn more, we can work to undo, learn some of our biases. That's really helpful for educators. And also taking the same approach with kids, that you can practice anything. So like our students too, they can practice spotting their biases and thinking through, how they act on them and what they do about them. And I think practicing what we preach as educators in that way can be helpful too.
Can I add something?
Okay, and Moniz? Yes.
Whitney touched on Black students being identified more for emotional behavior disorders. And I wanted to say this real quick, because this is something that we don't talk about when we hear the conversation about there are too many kids in special education. We don't talk about the trauma that is partly responsible for the kids who are diagnosed with emotional behavior disorder. Because if we're going to have conversations about trauma, they cannot be separate from conversations about special education. Because if we also know that research has told us that African Americans, we are passing on trauma because of what happened to us in this country. And now we got to think about the Hispanic kids who are being kept in cages. That's trauma. So that trauma is going to be something that's going to have to be addressed, because it's going to get passed on, because we cannot separate trauma from talking about special education, because the science is there saying that it's been passed on for African Americans. So if it's passed on for us, it's definitely going to be passed on for other people. So again, when people say that too many kids in special education, I'm waiting for them to finish the conversation, because they don't usually have anything else to go with it. It just stops there, because as someone who does the work, I know what I see. And a kid throwing chairs at a teacher or cussing a teacher out every day is not normal. And I know that there are underlying issues that are, making that behavior come to the surface. And again, we need to have these conversations, but we're not having a conversation beyond there are too many kids in special education. So, I mean, I'm here for people who want to have that conversation, because I have my years of experience to show you that it's not made up. EBD is not made up. I see it. It's not made up. I promise you it's not made up. And if you take a minute to look at a psychological evaluation, you can see what went into, what things were happening in the home, what things were happening in the community that contributed to that.
I definitely thank you for that. For those that might be just joining us, this is the fourth conversation with the installment of Unmasking the Realities series that we've been doing. And we talked about mental health, and we talked about trauma in a previous discussion, which you can find on our YouTube channel along with the others. But definitely, that plays a role in it when we talk about trauma and we talk about mental health being very significant. I want to get Shadiyah into the conversation. She is, I guess, she's a emerging teacher in there in Chicago. And so my question to you is, some thought leaders are convinced it's important to develop educational leaders who possess more of an equity-minded competency. And so with you not being too far from, graduating from school, is there capacity in graduate programs or educational programs to include a more of a race-conscious content into the curriculum?
I would say absolutely, because I feel like, just from my personal experience, a lot of my classes were pretty much general. And we had some instances at our school that involved race in a sense of like things that happened on campus. So a lot of our students, mostly Black and white, didn't know how to handle it. So a lot of our teachers didn't address it. Some of them didn't want to address it. Some of them just kind of ignored it, or they didn't know what was going on altogether, so they said. And so I think that when it comes to our educational structure, there's a lot of room for it, because the reality is it's too far in the game for us to say we don't know about some things anymore. We don't know about this. We don't understand that. It's too far in the game for this. We've been dealing with these issues, particularly with people of color in educational backgrounds for quite some time now. So we've been involved in everything. So there's no discipline. It can be social work. It can be communications, theology. At some point, you have people of color that are either contributors or some kind of way they're infused in that subject. So I think that acknowledging the people who make those contributions and people who are affected by those particular studies should actually be included. Because I feel like how many people actually will acknowledge not just the Greeks, but who taught the Greeks? So it's like including everyone in the conversation. So I think it's very much so room for adding race-conscious content to our academics, not just in graduate school, but let's start from kindergarten on up and include it into the curriculum.
And I think that leads into, when you talk about educating our children, I think it serves them interest when they see themselves in that educational realm, but it also serves a purpose for those students who are not of that demographic as well. I know one of the things that we are a institution that fosters history. We embrace the stories of African American history, but this is for not just African American students. This is to be learned and understood and have greater understanding by all students, regardless of their race. And so it can benefit all of our students. So definitely, thank you for that. Did anyone want to add to that?
Chris, when I talked earlier about dismantling how we do school, higher ed's included in that. It's a hot mess, right? So people are so territorial, and if you're in a teacher education program, these are the only classes you can take. So we are putting out teachers and police officers and lawyers and doctors who have only taken courses in their discipline. They've never taken an African American Studies course. They've never taken a course on the history of Latin America or the history of Latinos in this country or any other underrepresented group. They've never taken a sociology course. I'm gonna big up sociology every chance I get because I'm a sociologist by training, right? But if we get emerging teachers, emerging police officers, emerging lawyers, and require them to take these courses, they will at least come out having heard about structural racism, right? We have teachers making large gaffes in classrooms and then being able to say, well, I had no idea that was offensive. If we required these kind of courses that taught about structural inequities as part of their schooling, because we weren't so territorial about how many credits someone has to have in their particular discipline, we would all be starting off in a much better position. We're sending people out unequipped to deal with the things that are perpetuating inequality.
And I'm sorry,
yes.
Just go off of that, even with, let's say, like with the kids that I teach, that I worked with last year, with all that was going on, they knew a lot more than we gave them credit for. So I think that letting them be heard and let them learn more about it instead of them coming into a situation where they're like the adults making assumptions. Let's actually teach them, but we can't teach what we don't know. So having that background to even teach people who are coming to education or social work or whatever discipline, like Dr. Bates said, they need to learn it as well. Because I know at my school, we had certain classes we were told to take, and we were told, okay, this particular discipline takes this. And then you had a few, okay, take theology, take philosophy. Okay, that's great. And we had one or two history class, but you know they're going to take the one they feel most comfortable and the one they're going to be most successful in. So it's not a challenge for me to go through a history that I know or a area that I know. So I'm not going to take that leap and go into, like, let's say a Latin American history class or a Chinese history class or Chinese language. They're not going to do that. Unfortunately, you have some, but most of them won't. And so then they get that excuse of, like, again, I don't know. I didn't know that was offensive. I didn't know I couldn't say that. I didn't know that happened. So I think it's time now for including it in all education. That way we have no more excuses of why we don't know something.
Thank you. I definitely, we do have some comments and questions in the chat, which I will get to here in a minute, but I would like to bring Yolanda into this conversation. She's an educator in one of the largest school districts in the state of Ohio, and that is Cincinnati Public School District. And so some educators may not be aware of how their practices may reinforce inequalities. In addition, educators may not be aware of the challenges confronting minority students, and we kind of talked about that, right? Especially when we talk about trauma and whatever communities they're coming from. But because of their lack, the appropriate preparation to teach them, what are the realities of this gap of understanding, and how can we close that gap?
Okay. So I'll start with the gaps. First and foremost, Dr. Bates touched on this earlier. The failure to acknowledge that racial injustice is a problem. Like, some people just don't want to just acknowledge that it's a problem. There's a belief that if it doesn't happen to me, it doesn't exist. So that is a problem in and of itself, just like acknowledging it. Much of our history has been whitewashed. And so, we get into the school systems and, as it's been stated earlier, teachers are being trained in a certain way. And so they don't know and they don't understand, how our minorities, general minority populations are impacted, our history, why we do certain things that we do. And so they need to understand that, understand what's driving behaviors, et cetera. And then also just to, be reflective, there's failure to know our own history so we can be advocates for ourselves. So, we're a lot of times, we're expecting others to respond and do things, but there are some things that we have to do ourselves. And also there was some talk about essentially shame and humiliation. So when we start digging into the disenfranchisement and digging into the systems that are in place and the continuation of these systems, it's like we said, there's no more, that excuse is tired now. But the shame and humiliation will put people in a state of paralysis. And so it would cause them to not want to take, I guess, appropriate action to address, racial inequality within their school system. So some of the things that we can do to address it, first and foremost, we got to have the hard conversation. Many people just don't like to talk, don't like to talk about things that are uncomfortable, like even within our own cultures. So we talk about, ourselves, our family history, why are we doing what we're doing? But, when it's uncomfortable, we don't like to talk about it. We have to teach our students and our children that it's okay to talk about uncomfortable things, and we have to work through those challenges. And also for the key educators in the field of education. Some of us. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, Yolanda, and you said something, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but you talked about having the conversation. You have a significant where you don't teach in the school district that you live in.
Correct.
And so when you talk about this conversation should be had at the school board level and have that trickle down through the school system, or
Yeah.
is
Actually, I think it needs to go two ways. So Shadiyah also stated earlier that we got to start at the kindergarten level. It needs to go up as well. So I think it may be harder to come down from the school district. Our school districts need to be intentional and strategic about addressing the gaps, but a lot of times it's met with resistance. As we talk about the shame and humiliation, and people feel like if they say, oh, yes, this has been going on, that, they're going to be viewed in a negative light. But they have to be strategic and intentional, and we have to teach our children. We have to teach them young. We have to engage them at all grade levels, because they have to learn that these systems are not beneficial. I'll say that these systems are not beneficial, but that they are the catalyst of change. That at any age, at any grade level, that they can get in here and inflict change in the system, and work through the inequalities, and bring forth major changes.
Thank you. I definitely want to get into
Chris,
some of the comments on the chat, but someone has something to add from the panel. Yes.
Chris, I'm sorry. One.
No, go, Yolanda. Go ahead.
Yeah, one other area that's very, very important is that we have to engage the parents. So we talk a lot about the teachers and the students, but we have to make sure the parents are engaged, so that as these conversations are taking place, because as we talk about the difficult conversations, sometimes the kids are going to go home, and you don't want to leave them wondering or leave them feeling empty. So we got to engage the parents as well, so that the parents can continue those conversations. It's not an overnight process. So the parents need to be a key factor in this as well.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Bates.
The only thing I was going to add is Yolanda brought up school boards, and I think it is super important. I got my vote pen on, that we vote, right? Like, so in a lot of places, I know not in every place, but in a lot of places, school boards are elected, right? We currently have somebody on our school board in the city of Mason that did not even show up for a debate, and she won, right? So we have to go out and vote for school board if we have the power to do that. In places where school boards are put in place by mayors or whatever the case may be, we have to, as constituents, make our voices heard, right? So I may not vote for school board because the mayor places the school board in place, but I vote for the mayor. And so if I'm displeased with your school board placement, that might be reflected in how I vote for you later, right? And so thinking about how participation in the political process impacts every single part of our lives.
Absolutely. Go vote. I think that's very important, because we have a large segment of the population that's so focused on the elected executive office position, but our local and state elected positions are so significant in bringing about a change. I'm going to try to do my best to get through some of the questions and comments in the chat. I want to thank all of you that are participating and joining us for this conversation. We're going to try to use our time wisely and get through as much as possible. But I definitely want to go back to the terms, and someone, Christina Weeder, she had asked a question. She says where she's located at, they use the term student groups instead of subgroups. And so she asks, does the term student group feel problematic as well?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
And I understand why she made that differentiation, but here's the thing. If we just change the name and we're still doing the same thing with the information, what difference does it make? So if we're still going to have meetings where we talk about data and we call them student groups instead of subgroups, but we're not changing our instructional practices, we're not changing our the way we operate inside of a school building. You know, if we're not addressing the needs of our students, what's the point of changing the name of the student group if nothing else is going to change? Right? That's just like you being out running, going for a run, and you come home and take off your sweaty shirt and put on a clean shirt. You still stink. Nothing changed, right? But your shirt, nothing changed. So if we're not going to change our conversations, it doesn't matter. We could change that name like 20 times, but if we're not getting to the root of the problem, you know, and how we're going to address the needs of those students, it doesn't matter.
Thank you. It's also asked the question is regarding the standardized testing. Have we considered challenging the so-called testing system? And so if anyone would like to address, you know, the standardized testing that takes place in many states, you know, what is your take, I guess, when it comes to the standardized testing?
So I think that our former First Lady said it best. If I was based on my test scores, I would not be here right now. So I think that there are a lot of colleges who are talking about now, they want to get rid of the tests for admitting students into the school. And I think that that's fair, because I feel like, I know from when I was in high school, I didn't get the proper ACT or SAT prep. So when it came down to taking the test, I remember the month before they got us this random prep that was once a week, every other week. So imagine going into your test trying to figure out, did I learn this? I have no idea what this is. But I can do great academically, but this test will probably screw me over. So I think that in the case of having them for, it's like identification, or like for saying how good this student may be or how smart they may be, I think, yes, let's get rid of them. That's definitely challenging. In some districts, they are challenging the standardized tests, particularly for colleges. So yes.
We know that they're culturally biased, right? We know that they're about class. And so I always, when I'm talking about tests, tell the story of when I took the ACT. There was a question on the ACT that, and I don't remember the entire thing now, I'm showing how old I am. But part of it was like, when you say this is to that as this is to that, you have to compare the two things. And one part of the question was, yacht is to slip as, and I don't remember what the comparison was. Yacht is to slip. Y'all know what that is? A slip is where you park your yacht. I didn't know that. I ain't never even seen a yacht. But that was a question on my ACT test.
Absolutely. You know, definitely, I struggle, you know, with that. When I was in high school, it was a SAT, was the test that was held your standards or your fate of what college you would go to, and then I think it got shifted to ACT. But I think there are areas of change that need to take place in that regard.
Can I just add one thing? That
yes.
This and some of the other parts of our conversation feel like a real opportunity during COVID, and I hope so much is being disrupted right now, and you know, a lot of it is detrimental, but it does give us the opportunity to rethink some systems. So you know, several districts, all districts in the spring said, we're not going to test this spring, we're just going to let it go. And I know there's a lot of debate about that for this year. And so I hope, instead of going, you know, right back to what we did before, we can take the opportunity as a society to say, like, you know what, we didn't test for a year and the world didn't burn down. And so what if we think about more equitable ways of assessing our students to get them what they need, and helping find the right fit for them in wherever they go next, you know, higher education or other opportunities. So I hope on this and so many other things that we don't decide to just go back to what was there before, but we take the opportunity to blow it up a little bit and figure out more equitable ways of rebuilding the systems.
Absolutely. I would say some of the I've seen in the chat talking about mandatory ethnic study requirements for students, but it seemed to be on a university level. And I guess that's in regards to the when we talked about as far as teachers being educated. But I think it's interesting that Moniz also doubled down on the fact that, you know, some of this education needs to be throughout the entire educational process, not just necessarily relegated to the university. I don't know if anyone wanted to address anything in that regard.
Can I make a book suggestion for the people in the chat? Because I'm seeing some stuff come up.
Yes.
Cultivating Genius by Dr. Gholdy Muhammad. If you are a classroom teacher, if you are a parent and you're concerned about what your students are learning in school, even for those who might be at the higher education level and may have some like sway over the teacher education program, I highly suggest that people get that book and they read it.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. Cultivating Genius by Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, Gholdy, Gholdy Muhammad. She's a associate professor of education at Georgia State University, and I had the privilege of taking a year-long professional development with her. So I'm learning about this, and it's a year long, and it needed to be a year long because it's a lot to take. Because you have to look at what she's given you, and you have to look at what you've been taught, and you have to really just essentially just demolish it and start from the bottom. Like Dr. Bates was saying earlier, you got to start from the bottom, from scratch. But I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity, because now I can see how I can bring in some history for my Hispanic students as well as my African American students in math and science, without just, oh, let me read this book by this Black person and you know, saying that's it. Because I'm actually going to bring in the Mayans and the Egyptians in my math and my science classroom, so that they can see themselves in the curriculum, and they can see how the curriculum was adulterated, because we did math, that's us, that's ours. But all these years they've not been told that. So now I get the opportunity to discuss that with my students, and hopefully get someone to see that, oh, I'm not bad at math because my ancestors were doing math before anybody else. I just have to understand that I learned math differently. So now I have the opportunity to kind of change my thinking and the way I approach math and science. So
one of the and questions I think is very fascinating, and I think about my educational development. I remember taking Wood's class and these other you had home ec classes and whatnot, and so I tend to think back to this, asking this question. This is open up to the panel. How can we put more emphasis on vocational training and or schooling versus a lot of attention being placed on STEM, science, technology, and engineering, and so forth, as well as ethnic studies, but also putting a greater emphasis on vocational training, because not everyone's going to go to college, not everyone's going to be a scholar, but we need people to do electricity, we need people to do plumbing, and so what is your take on that?
I think shifting the conversations early, because I know my school in high school was it was like a magnet school. So it was like we did a lot of academics. We didn't do the vocational. And I think that, yes, making that clear that everyone is not going to do college, but not everyone who doesn't do college is not going to be a failure. They have other skills they can do and they can learn. So I think that having other opportunities. So I think instead of having just straight up colleges or having just the military come to the school, let's have electricians come to the high school. Let's have actual people who are mechanics coming into the high schools, who can actually show kids, you know, you don't really need a college education to be successful. Not saying you can't get one, but there are other highways to success as well.
can I add to that real quick? Chris, I know you remember when we were in school, we had, there was auto mechanics, there was wood shop. Those things were not looked down upon by anybody. Those kids rebuilt cars. So the thing is, we're not in the mindset that you got to go to college. The school systems are the ones removing those programs from the schools. It's not teachers saying that you have to go to college and a vocation is not going to make you any money. The school systems are the ones making those decisions to remove those programs from the schools. It's not teachers, because I tell kids all the time, figure out what it is you like to do, and we're gonna figure out how to get you to the point where you can make some money. I'll tell kids, we're gonna get you to the point where you're gonna make some money doing what you like to do. Because college may not be for everybody, but I always tell kids, you gotta have something. Because if you want to make some money, you gotta have some kind of training. And you know, if you say to me, well, I like working on cars, I'm gonna push you to go to a school to get your certificate so you can be certified, so you can make a little bit more money than you would just working as an assistant in an auto body shop, because I want you to make that money, period. Whether you have a college degree or not, I want you to make that money, right? So it's not teachers who are saying, go to college, go to college, go to college. It's the school systems in the states who are not funding these programs anymore. That's saying, go to college, go to college, go to college, right?
If I could add, I think some of it too is broadening our definition of what STEM is. So if, you know, we as a society are communicating that STEM is only working in a research lab or being an astronaut or being a doctor, it's so much broader than that. Mechanics is STEM, you know, being an electrician is STEM. And so being sure when we talk about it, that we're talking about it very broadly. And as we've all said, I think being able to see yourself in that profession. And Ohio, I think as a state has made a little bit of progress here in that in rethinking the graduation requirements, they are moving a little bit toward having a portfolio or externships or things that aren't strictly, you know, graduation test scores be part of something that fulfills your graduation requirements. I think some universities are also thinking more broadly about what an application could be made up of. And so, you know, if a kid can submit a maker portfolio, for instance, of things they've made instead of standardized test scores, and you know, be welcomed into either a university environment or a two-year college, you know, or whatever, like that, starting to broaden our definition of what's acceptable. And if you listen to some of the things that some of our senators in Ohio have said, you know, about the dignity of work and the importance of careers like manufacturing, you know, to Ohio. There are more manufacturing facilities in Ohio than there are McDonald's franchises, which, you know, blows my mind. Wow. Being able to communicate just the breadth of opportunity there, I think may help.
I want to ask I'd like to add to that. One of the things that we have to do as educators is to have our kids to show up, because some of these programs are available, you know, whether they're STEM or not STEM. Some of our kids are just not showing up. They are just not, I guess, encouraged or maybe not really understand why they should pursue it. So we all here, you know, the panel, we know and we understand, but we have to make sure our students are understanding as well, that when the program, like Monique mentioned that the schools are taking them away, and it could be partly because the students are not showing up and participating. And so we have to make sure that we're encouraging them to show up for these programs as well.
We have to dismantle respectability politics and elitist ideas about what success looks like.
Exactly.
And I think that speaks to what Yolanda is saying, right? Like, they are not showing up because they think I'm supposed to go to college, right? This idea that there is a respectable way to become successful. I am college educated, I have a PhD, and I have a child who's been saying she wants to be a hairdresser for the last 4 years. As soon as she's old enough to sign up for classes, we're gonna get her signed up, because I'm never paying to get my hair done again. And I'm gonna be borrowing money from her because she's gonna make a lot of money, right? So I think just readjusting our lens on what success looks like, right? Doing away with respectability politics and saying what success looks like is being able to financially support your family. If you do that as a professor, high five. If you do that as a mechanic, high five, right? Just dismantling all these supremacist ideologies and notions about what it looks like to be successful.
I will say our institution, we had worked with the Cincinnati Youth Collaborative, and we did this program called Pathways to Power, where we introduced students to degrees of career opportunities. And I remember bringing in two gentlemen that had their own plumbing business, and they make extremely amount of money. One I know personally, he has a slingshot, he has a boat,
And does he have a yacht with a slip?
He doesn't have a yacht with a slip, but he's created a wonderful life from himself, doing a vocational job that, yes, is looked down upon by many people within our society. So it is very, very important to do that. I do want to get to one question, I think, from an educator that is very important and I think very germane to our conversation. And it is talk about conversation and starting the conversation. They are in a situation where they work in a racially diverse urban school, which is mostly a white faculty. And so they're trying to start this conversation. And when I see this, I harken back when I used to be an academic coach through the National Law Foundation, and we would go for this training. And one of the alarming statistics that was in 2006, at the time when I was doing this, it said that 86% of educators are white women where education was their second career choice. And so what advice would you give for someone, an educator that's in a position and they want to have these difficult conversations in their school, but they know that they are the minority in that faculty?
Dr. Gholdy Muhammad told us to find our team, our squad in the building. It might be one person, it might be three, and that might be it. Start there. Sometimes you're your own squad, because the reality is we all don't work in perfect education institutions. I'm just gonna be real. We all don't work in perfect education institutions. Sometimes there's a lot of pushback when you want to bring a new idea to the table. And just like most of us are going to our rooms and close the door to keep out the mess, sometimes you got to have that approach when you're trying to make some change, and you have to start in your classroom with the kids who are in front of you. Start in your classroom with the kids who are in front of you. But you're fortunate if you can find at least one person to be on your team. That's a start, And again, you have to weigh everything that's going on in your particular work situation too.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we are getting close to the hour, and definitely want to be respectful of time. And so I want, respectively, everyone, any last final remarks that you want to make before I make my closing remarks. But in doing that, while you're gathering your thoughts together, I have to give a shout out to Dr. Eric Jackson. He is tuning in. Of those that don't know, he is a wonderful professor at Northern Kentucky University, and he is a great intellectual power. Like myself, he's from Indiana, Gary, GI, and so I thank him for participating and joining in, and everyone. And so if we can begin, with respectively, what lasting remarks that you want to leave with those that have tuned in, who will see this recording once we upload it to our YouTube channel, that you want people to walk away with. And if we can begin with Shadiyah, can we begin with you? If that's fine, and then we'll work our way.
Yes, so I was making a little bit of a notes, and I just want to say, kind of going off of what Miss Monish was saying, but just have the conversations. Like I remember my pastor used to say, it's cold turkey, but it's good when you're hungry. So I feel like you have to have these conversations. And secondly, like she was saying, have those conversations with your students. Start in your classrooms. Like I said, you may find that they know a lot more than you give them credit for. And we look at what's going on now in the country with all the cities and what's going on in every respective city. The youth are who are leading these revolts, if you will. They're leading the charge for change. So we have to be careful when we're in our classroom, what we say and how we teach, because you don't know what leader you're making here. So we're kind of like second parents. So we have to be very careful that we are educating them properly, and we're actually nourishing them, not just giving them, okay, we're babysitting you for 8 hours. That's not what this is for. We're supposed to actually grow your mind. And if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our job. So I would say just have those conversations in any respected setting that you're in, academically or otherwise. Just have them. And you may find that there are people who actually agree with you, who are just scared to say it, but you got it out for them. So I would just say that.
Thank you. Thank you. Moniz?
Okay, I'll be brief because I've talked a whole lot. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate this opportunity because I don't always get to have this kind of conversation in my professional role. So I appreciate being able to talk to these wonderful people, these amazing women. Let's not be content with doing the same thing that we've always done. That's what I'm going to say. Let's not be content with doing the same thing that we've always done. We have to move forward. And like Shadiyah said, we're teaching the kids who are going to make the changes, because some of them are already out there in the streets. We're teaching these kids. So they know more than we think they know, and they're waiting for us to start these conversations with them.
Thank you. Thank you. And Yolanda, if you can, your final take.
Okay, I would say that as we are approaching this and as we are trying to engage others outside of our circle, that we be mindful, we be compassionate as people work through, as I stated earlier, shame and maybe embarrassment, but we have to be compassionate and we have to be open to help them work through it and help them heal through the process, because we can't do this on our own. We need more allies to help dismantle this system. So just keep that in mind. Just, sometimes things might get a little heated, but if people are trying, meet them where they are so that we can progress, make some progress and move forward.
Thank you. Thank you. And Whitney.
I think talking about, I think it's easy for teachers to come under fire and for us to pick the things, we know them when we see them. I think when things go wrong, and I would say also support the educators in your lives and your colleagues when they go right. So if you have somebody who's trying out, teaching a novel by an author of color for the first time maybe, or who introduced the Egyptians to math class for the first time, say, hey, I love the way you did that. Tell me more. How did it go? Or if you, many of us are parents on this panel, we were talking about back to school with our kids just before the session. If your teacher, if your children tries a new thing, say, hey, I love that you're teaching a more diverse, group of authors. Or this year, have you seen this great resource for history from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center or Museum Center, or another great resource in your life? Support good change when we see it, and help feed that momentum, and hopefully that grows the squad that Moniz was talking about bigger and bigger and bigger until you're a real movement. Thanks so much. I'm so honored to be on this panel and to learn from all of you. Thanks.
Thank you. And Littisha, if you don't mind, I saved you for last for a reason.
Well, your expectations are always way better for me than I have for myself. I'm just lucky to be able to be on this panel with these amazing women who are in the trenches doing such awesome work and getting the job done. I commend you all for being in the classroom, working every day, especially at a time like this. I think what I might leave people with is it's okay to be uncomfortable, right? I think I saw in the chat, somebody was like, how do you do this and keep people comfortable? I don't want people comfortable. When you're comfortable, you don't change. And so for me, it is about creating discomfort, creating disruption that forces us to reflect on the systems that we're operating in, that we are creating, that we are perpetuating, that we are failing to dismantle. And we can do that with empathy and grace, but we also have to be okay being uncomfortable. I have a saying that I say, if you ever heard me speak, you've probably heard me say it. You can feel how you feel, but what are you gonna do with those feelings? So I don't care about making you uncomfortable, but are you gonna take that discomfort and use it for good? Are you gonna take that discomfort and become an accomplice of mine to dismantle these systems that we know are perpetuating inequality, right? allies are good, but accomplices are even better, right? Because accomplice means that you're going to go and do it with me, right? You're going to be holding my hand and I'm going to be holding yours. And so operating in empathy and grace, because this isn't a sprint, right? This is a long journey, and some of us are at very early stages of our journey. And so empathy and grace are super important. But discomfort is going to happen. If you are a person who does not understand how your ancestors have had advantage over centuries, it's gonna be pretty stinking uncomfortable for you to find out that you're perpetuating inequality. It's going to be pretty stinking uncomfortable for you to figure out how to separate your personal ideas about yourself from systems that you benefit from, right? And so I'm okay with making people uncomfortable. I've even been said to do that, to intentionally make people uncomfortable, but you won't change if you're comfortable. And if we really want change, we're all going to have to become very uncomfortable and be okay with that discomfort. You can feel how you feel, but what are you going to do with those feelings?
Thank you. Thank you. There is a lot of recognition and appreciation going through the chat, and I just wanted to verbally share that with the panel. I want to thank all of you. I would like to share, someone said, for once in my life, I feel like people understand what I understand, and I feel like y'all, meaning the panel, actually care. And so I'm going to leave my final remarks with that. Actually care. We are embraced with some challenging times. The lack of humanity towards individual is glaring, it's disappointing, and most of all, it's frustrating. When will the time come where we look at each other, embrace each other with humanity? Our children, our mothers, our fathers. This has been an ongoing challenge for our society for far too long. We look at individuals as being threats versus looking at them as being fathers. And you know what I'm talking about what I'm talking about. The situation that's going on in Wisconsin. The glaring reality as someone can carry one instrument of violence and not be a threat, but can carry a cell phone and looked upon as a threat, even though it's only a cell phone. This has been an ongoing issue that's been going on for so long, and it transcends through many sectors of our society. And so education is not void of this. We must do better. We need to do better, or our society will fail for generations to come. And so I want to leave you with these words. Encourage yourself in the circle around you to know better and to do better. I'm just going to keep it plain and simple. If you need help, institutions around you. Be a force in your respective community for humanity, for empathy, for compassion, and understanding. We are at a critical juncture. So I want to encourage all of you. I want to thank this wonderful panel for joining us. This will be part of our YouTube series and our YouTube channel with the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Thank you for taking out your time today to be a part of this conversation and spread the word. Thank you, thank you, thank you.